Welcome to Certificate Course in Dialogue Studies, Week 14. We have with us today Danish Iqbal, who would be speaking on emotion in public life. Danish Iqbal is an assistant professor at the Department of English, Aligarh Muslim University. His areas of interest include literary theory, intersections between literature and history, and secularism. We welcome you, Danish Iqbal, and we hope that our participants will learn a lot from you. You have 2 hours to conduct the session, and you can do it however you like. Usually there's a question-answer round after the session, but what you can also do is you can have it in the middle of as you like. I would like to remind the participants to please switch on their cameras, as that it is mandatory, and make the session more interactive. The floor is all yours, Danish. Please take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Pragya, and everyone for making it to the session. I must begin by first, once again, submitting my very heartfelt thanks to the In Dialogue Foundation for inviting me over again. This is my 3rd such meeting with this program, and I must tell you that each of these iterations has been quite a learning experience to me. Before I move on, if at any point you are unable to hear me clearly, or if I am invisible to you, please feel free to bring it to my attention. So in the past 2 meetings that I've had with this group earlier, on both those occasions, I brought to this meeting something which either I had discovered recently or something that has caught my attention, and I was myself in the process of finding more about it. So this time around, the story is the same. That is something that I've been reading on lately, and I thought maybe I should bring it to the table and maybe invite your own remarks, as well as maybe your own prior familiarity with the topic. So at the same time, I also hope to accomplish a few objectives by the end of this discussion, is to establish an account that is meaningful enough for all of us, as well as also to try and explore collectively some of the ways in which we can integrate these insights into what we think is of shared importance, that is the idea of dialogue. So, as Ms. Pragya has already spelled out, I will be talking about emotions and public life. So, a large part of my discussion will be devoted to emotion, and I'll try and elucidate a philosophical account that I found quite convincing and inviting in the works of a contemporary philosopher and scholar, Professor Martha Nussbaum. And in the later part of the discussion, I hope to carry forward these insights into emotion in order to present to you, and hopefully with your help, invite you to think together towards reimagining, so to speak, emotion as a very important part of our public life. So, to that effect, I had also shared with you an introduction to a book that she wrote a few years ago. Uh, that was titled Political Emotions: Why Love Matters for Justice. So, even if you have not managed to read it thoroughly, it's all just fine. But if you would have skimmed through it, you would have gotten a flavor of what the book promises to do or achieve. In her words, the project that she sets out to do is to establish the not only salience but the shape and makeup of emotion, the distinct shape that emotion should have as a principle dependent endeavor in political and public life. So I'm sure that emotion has our daily life is in fact regulated, anchored, driven, shaped, and determined by emotions. So all of us have some already existing idea as to what emotion is, what should be the extent of emotion in our lives, generally speaking, but more importantly, in our dealings with other people, right, around us. So this is not a very unfamiliar thing, an unfamiliar part of our life. Yet, as several philosophers, contemporary philosophers have, uh, noted, it remains an underexplored, scholarly, in scholarly terms, I would say, underexplored area. So uh, there are several, philosophical accounts of emotions from various perspectives, from the perspective of psychology, cognitive psychology, neurosciences, pragmatism, anthropology, philosophy, and all of them have their own axe to grind. Uh, what I have picked here is a philosophical account that Professor Martha Nussbaum presents. In Of late, she has been writing about it for more than 2 decades now. But she has particularly written two very, I would say, landmark volumes on this subject. One is The Upheavals of Thought, and the other is the book that a chapter out of which I shared with you. So uh, I'll first, as I said, lay out to you her understanding of emotions and the debate that she enters with the existing views on emotions. And at the end of my discussion, that is, having laid out what she's to say about emotions, I'll then invite you to probably share your remarks, or if you wish, or also you want to clarify something with me, what I've said regarding what I've said. So please feel free to do so. But for the next few minutes, maybe I can just have your attention, and I'll tell you uh, the precise debate that she takes up regarding this topic, that is the place of emotions in human life. So, conventionally speaking, all of us believe that emotions are some fleeting moments of irrational behavior, some fleeting moments of eruptions, which are not to be considered as moments laden with insights, as moments that promise any value. However, and at the same time, I think this is also illustrated by some of the phrases that we use, some of the sayings that we employ in our daily parlance, and For example, in the heat of the moment, I got carried away. So they already, in a sense, signify that emotions are something that are not supposed to be. Uh, they're not supposed to be taken seriously, as against thoughts, right? Which are more laid back, which are more deliberative, which are also cold-blooded at times, which are also well thought out, as we say. So, or something which is a product of our more refined and reformed ways of approaching the world around us. Now, without actually, I would say, naming uh, ancient Greek philosophers or Stoics, in the interest of general discussion, I'll simply highlight some of the key issues that she takes up with such a view. So, first of all, she proposes that emotions, okay, hello, there's a request that I have to speak up a little bit. Can someone confirm if this is all right?
Yeah, this sounds fine, I guess. With earplugs though.
Okay. Yeah, I'm perfectly comfortable with that complaint because I'm quite given to mumbling. So yeah, if at any point it fades away, do let me know. So yeah, so she takes up cudgels with that view, and she proposes, in fact, that emotions are uh, modes of judgment. All right. So instead of simply looking at emotions as irrational eruptions, she invites us to think about emotions as judgments. All right. So that is the key movement in that sense in her work. And she then kind of lays out that what are the distinct features of this claim for someone to say that emotion has to be looked at as judgment. So judgment already involves a ring of evaluation, right? So she calls it evaluative judgment, which is, I think, normally the function we ascribe to reason, right? That it allows us to form judgments on certain things and attribute value to it. So she says that before we go on to think about how it functions as evaluative judgment, we also need to acknowledge something which is distinct to emotions. That is, that it also begins with an acknowledgement of certain neediness, you know, and to quote her again, a lack of self sufficiency. All right. So, emotions are always, in a sense, presaged by a certain feeling, or let's avoid that word feeling. I'll come to that later. A certain instance of neediness and a lack of self sufficiency. So, these are her words. And she, in fact, begins a chap. I mean, in one of the in a chapter in one of on the other book, she in fact begins by recounting her own experience in one of the most intense moments in her life, where she's been invited to give a lecture at a university, and then she finds out that her mother is hospitalized and she's in a very critical condition. So she goes ahead with her invitation and delivers the lecture with that uncertainty around her mother's health. And immediately afterwards, she discovers that she has to go back. So she travels, and upon reaching the hospital, she discovers that her mother has passed away. So she begins with that anecdote. And in fact, demonstrates very convincingly that how throughout the experience of having received that news that her mother is unwell, critically ill, and the fact that she might also die, she, in a sense, examines her own flush of emotions, right, in order to make these points. So, emotions as judgment and emotions that are presaged by a certain neediness and self sufficiency. So, the words that we use in order to describe emotions, So, just to give you an indicative list of the states of mind or the states or the dispositions which she calls emotions could be grief, fear, joy, hope, uh, love, anger, hate, jealousy, pity, guilt. So these are several emotions, kinds of emotions which we experience as well and which form the stuff of our daily life. And these set of emotions, they're distinct from other set of emotions. For example, feeling of fatigue or being hungry, you know, uh, hunger, for example. Uh, these are not in the same league. So, how are they distinct? So, the first thing that she identifies is that um, emotions are always about something. All right. So, emotions in that sense have an object. So, in her case, like if she is fearing for her mother's life, that emotion she's experiencing of fear has an object, that is her mother, right? So, emotion in that sense is always about something. And the rest of her description is, in fact, is to do with unpacking the aboutness of emotion. All right. So, what all flows from the fact that emotions are always about something? Then, once we have identified that emotions have an object, the second characterization that she presents is that that these are intentional objects, right? So it is an intentional object. What does that mean? So it means that uh, the the object of the emotion is then seen or interpreted by someone, right? So these are not emotion. I mean, this object is not something which has no bearing whatsoever on the perceiving or the seeing subject. All right. And this is another important part of the uh, description here. It is about something, and that object is an intentional object, which means uh, the that the fact that the object which is part of the emotion, in the sense that it is what the emotion is about, is then seen or interpreted by someone. So that is the another important aspect of calling it an emotion and intentional object. Now, this aboutness of the object to her is rather a very visceral kind of interiority to it. In other words, uh, it in fact shapes that way of seeing something. In other words, it is the aboutness of the emotion which shapes the identity of the object. Right? Again, to go back to her own example, It is her love for mother, which shapes how she identifies her, right? So it has an intentional object, and it determines the how that object is interpreted or seen. So uh, this intentionality in that sense is distinct from some sort of a mechanical registry of that object. In other words, we see and interpret a lot of things, but we do not see and interpret all of those things with the same intentionality, right? So it is the intentionality of the object which distinguishes the relationship between the which in fact attributes the aboutness of the object. So she's trying to, in simpler words, we can simply say that if, let us say, there's a wind directed at ocean, there's wind blowing around or above the sea, right? Now, the identity of the wind still remains as wind, regardless of how it touches the surface of the ocean, right? But the object of the emotion here, in her case, being the mother, her own mother, that intentionality is the very thing which distinguishes that what we call emotion. So to reiterate, I have told so far two characteristics. One is that it is about something, and the aboutness is, in other words, the intentionality of that object. The third aspect of our discussion around emotion is that it is not that emotions simply embody way something, but also forms belief about those complex ideas. All right. Very briefly. So she says that these emotions embody not simply ways of seeing an object, but beliefs about the object, right? So she fears for her mother's health, her mother's life, because she believes that she's very important to her, right? So belief is also a characteristic and an enduring aspect of that which we call emotion, right? So when you think of emotions as having a content, which is the object in this case that she calls the object of the emotion, and from then thereon to relate it to a certain kind of intentionality, which is premised on certain belief, then only can you go on to think of emotion as which as something which can also act as an edifice to judgment. So I hope you are with me so far. Now let me expand a little on the belief part. So she explains it like this, and let me read further. It's in all 3 to 4 sentences that I'll just read out. So she says it is not always easy or even desirable to distinguish between an instance of seeing X as Y from the belief that X is Y. All right. So she's saying, I repeat, it is not always easy or even desirable. To distinguish between an instance of seeing X as Y, seeing here means interpreting, taking it to be, like how she sees her mother as a valuable person in her life. So she's saying it's not always easy to distinguish between an instance of seeing X as Y, something as something else, from the belief that X is Y. So, in order to have fear, for example, I must believe that bad events are impending. So, for that emotion of fear to actually realize itself in someone, there should also be a belief that there is a threat involved looming ahead. Then only can that fear actually appear and occur as emotion, right? However, the moment you discover that this was a misplaced fear, if I told you that no, there is no tiger in the next room, then that fear dissipates, right? So the belief aspect is again very central to her conception of emotion. And finally, and this is the most crucial part of her description. Finally, she says that all of this, the intentional perception, the belief, the whatever uh, details that you attribute as the aboutness of the object, they all, in a sense, they're concerned with one thing, that is the idea of value, you know. So that aboutness of emotion, which I'm calling the object of the emotion having an object, in her case, her loving mother, it is the value which in fact sustains these other aspects of emotion, right? So there has to be something which is so, severely suffused with value that it appears in all these different ways, that is, as a distinct object, as a distinct intentional object, that is, you have a particular way of seeing it, looking at that object, interpreting that object. And finally, as she says, that they are all concerned with value. That is, they see their object as invested with value. So she, in fact, invokes a very familiar philosophical term from ancient Greece in order to, further concretize this thought. That is the Greek term eudaimonia, right? So let me just type it out in the chat box, maybe. Okay, right. Which is sometimes, and misleadingly so, as she is cautioned, translated as happiness. So that's a sort of a misleading understanding of eudaimonia. Rather, it, in fact, to give you a rough, ready translation or inference of the term which she presents, is the flourishing, human flourishing. Okay? So the agent's flourishing. Now flourishing has a slightly different tangent of meaning than simply happiness, which pop psychology, quite often centers itself around, is happiness. Now, for example, if I take someone to be very central to my idea of flourishing in my life, that person is part of that universe, which I call eudaimonistic world, the eudaimonia, which is an answer to the basic question, which is, how do I live? Right? So she says, like, this is in answer to this question, in reply to this question, that how do I live? So how do I flourish? How do I realize myself? So it is in that sense that she invokes the term eudaimonia. And in ethical theory, or in moral philosophy, she is a moral philosopher. So all the intrinsic value, everything that I take to be of intrinsic value in my life, without which I will sense a lack, a sense incompleteness. So I'll take you back to how I began. That it begins with an acknowledgement of lack of self-sufficiency, neediness, right? So eudaimonia, in fact, is that is everything without which we will, be faced with a certain lack of self-sufficiency. All right. So this, the centrality of eudaimonistic view to emotion is what, in fact, supplies to it with the idea of value. So once you take something to be of intrinsic value and extremely valuable to your own idea of flourishing, it forms the part of your eudaimonistic universe. All right. It could be anything. It could be a branch of a tree. It could be your own parents. It could be anything or anyone. But eudaimonia in that sense is the human flourishing, and it is suffused with the idea of value. Right. Now, moving on, this sense of incompleteness then drives us. It literally kind of projects us towards that object, right? And it is here that she talks about the approach of cognitive sciences, where, if you are trembling with fear, if you are extremely jittery, you can very well imagine if somebody is rushing back to a hospital, wondering whether they'll get to see their mother alive or dead. You can very well imagine what must be coursing through their mind as well as their body. So the directedness, which literally also drives you to embody that state of mind, to embody that emotion, is one part, but not the essential part of emotion. For example, if somebody is grieving, neurosciences will probably say that, these are the parameters, the changes in the readings, which must be, evident for someone to conclude that this is a person who's grieving. But she says it may or may not happen. All right. However, it is very difficult to separate the two. And this is how emotion then becomes judgment, where once you have established the value, once you have found something to be intrinsically valuable and worth to your own life, then it is extremely difficult to, in fact, say what precedes judgment. Is it simply the manifesting emotion which precedes judgment, and judgment lies elsewhere in a calm atmosphere? Not necessarily. Also, she cautions us against taking eudaimonistic view to be an instrumental view. All right. So just so that we do not think of, or let me in fact illustrate with example. Just so that she loves her mother and she takes her mother to be of quite valuable to her in her own life. Does that mean that her mother has no value in her own, or on her own rather, right? She says no. That would be a flawed understanding. So eudaimonistic does not actually uh, become synonymous with an egoist and utilitarian view of someone. All right. So I'll very briefly once again quote and just to satisfy this point further. She says that in a eudaimonistic theory, the actions, relations, and persons, that are included in the conception are not all valued simply on account of some instrumental relation they bear to the agent's satisfaction. And she's writing like a philosopher, but in simpler terms, you can very well relate to what she's saying, that the actions, relations, and persons who are valuable to the agent, to the perceiving, seeing, interpreting person, they are not valued simply on account of some instrumental relation. Just because I like, playing around with my pet, that should not be the only reason for me to find it valuable, or for one to establish that the pet dog is valuable, right? She says this is a mistake commonly made about such theories under the influence of utilitarianism, and, as I said, the misleading use of happiness as a translation for eudaimonia. Am I making sense? Or, as I usually summon this analogy in my classes, am I playing squash or are we playing lawn tennis here? So I hope it's not simply bouncing back to me. So yeah, just to probe a little further. So she says that not just actions, and this sentence will relate to the chapter that you may have read, even if cursorily so. Not just actions, but also mutual relations of civic or personal philia, that is love, in which the object is loved and benefited for his or her own sake, can qualify as constituent parts of eudaimonia. On the other hand, they are valued as constituents of a life that is my life and not someone else's, as my actions, as people who have some relation with me. So it is the expansion of the agent's horizon, in which everything that forms part of that eudaimonistic world also becomes valuable, right? So it is not instrumental, but of course they are valuable on their own, but at the same time, since the part of my world, my actions, my relations, um, uh, hence they are to be valued for that, right? So she says this is what emotions are like. Because when you are experiencing, let us say, extreme grief and sense of loss, it's almost, and if you can, unfortunately, if you have ever been there, look at the metaphors that you use. You will always use metaphors which will, in fact, fall back on some corporeal analogy. Like we also use the phrase like to be torn asunder from limb to limb, So this is very real in the sense that both the value and the way they manifest, they are happening one and the same at the same time. So, right. So, judgment in that sense is the constituent element of emotion. Since it is a judgment is a constituent element of emotion, uh, they are necessary conditions in that sense for other uh, elements, that is feelings and movements. So what does this movement mean? The very directedness, the action that follows, and uh, the relationships that you establish, these are what she indicate by the use of the word movements. And so to quote and end this description here, she says, we might even grant that judgment is a constituent element in the emotion, and as a constituent element, a sufficient cause of the other elements as well, and yet insist that there are other elements like feelings and movements that are not parts of the judgment. All right. For example, feeling of fatigue, they're not part of any judgment in the sense that emotion is, because there could be objectless emotions as well. There could be objectless feelings as well. For example, when you say that no, someone who does not find any value in how their life is going, so what we call depression in that sense could be an objectless mood, an objectless emotion, feeling, right? And so the recognizing of value in something, the recognition of the valuable object, and the upheaval, that is emotion, the eruption, she says they are one and the same part of me, that is the agent. So what I wanted to, in fact, establish by this, I think I've spoken for 40 minutes, I guess, now. So, in not so brief, I would say, interlude here is to, first of all, give you a framework through which we can begin to think about emotion as a form of judgment, not as something which exists outside of judgment first. All right. So, secondly, instead of thinking of emotions as merely about something, for example, if you're angry at losing something, right? So, of course, there is an aboutness to it. But there is a further entanglement of this aboutness in her description than a very short-lived reductionist view of looking at emotion as something which triggered something which was short-lived, fleeting, and does not really provide us with enough resources to think further about emotion as an entity of value and judgment in itself. All right. And so judgment in that sense, on the other hand, so I mean, by elaborating on emotion, Nussbaum for me is also telling us to rescue the idea of judgment from this received notion that it is some detached intellectual act. You get my point? So judgment in that sense does not have to be a detached intellectual act. Rather, it has to be a very involved, and to use the word emotion colloquially, it has to be emotional. You get my point? So by bringing the two together, not bringing the two together, by teasing out judgment out of emotion, she is also establishing that how something which is such a such an important part of our life has remained outside the purview of any serious and sustained scholarly, philosophically informed as well as practically lived deliberation in our public life. Now, this is what I had to say regarding the philosophical account of emotion. While introducing me, Ms. Pragya said that I'm going to talk about emotion, public life. It is emotion and public life. So the other part of my focus is to be on public life. Now, this is something which I expect each of you to have something to say about. And hopefully, by going over what you think public life or public culture means, I will have something to say regarding how we can work towards not ceding emotions only to a particular kind of principle in public life, right? So if you think about our contemporary world, particularly the contemporary democracies across different nations, you will find that, and there's something that she begins with, in the essay that I circulated, that all nations have emotions, all societies experience emotions, right? All societies work with certain emotions. But of course, there are emotions that are worth preserving, and there are emotions that one has to guard oneself against, right? But in order to, in fact, intellectually engage emotionally, right? One has to first break down this distinction. One has to first come to an understanding that emotions are house judgment, right? Otherwise, that's why you see that the rampant and almost unremitting rise of certain ideologies that have a very potent emotional appeal has something to do with the otherwise political culture, which prides itself in keeping emotion outside of public life. I hope I'm making sense here, right? So the current struggle for a viable, equitable, accessible, and sustainable public life, in all meaningful sense of the phrase, has to do with how meaningfully we engage with emotion, right? So before I proceed, is there anyone who would like to share their reflections on first the essay that I had circulated, the introductory essay that I circulated, and if they have something at all to say about what I have said so far? Please go ahead, anyone.
Can I go ahead?
Yes, Irfan, please.
Yes. First of all, thank you so much for your detailed explanation, Dr. Saab, regarding the emotions that the book has encountered in different means. So we can say that emotion support is a crucial ability of human civilizations, or we can say the humans in different scenarios, whether it may be the social, political, or our mental health. It plays a different role. So, from your perspective, you being in a position where you have to teach the students, or where you have to come in with the dialogue in the different forms or in conversations, have you come across with a situation where you feel a participant or a person is saying something emotionally? and how you have identified that, and what guidelines you have identified, how you believe that and personal is and participant is saying something but he is emotionally driven, and what in those situations what you usually do.
Myself.
Yes, yes.
Well, I'll answer your question, but I also sense that you have used emotion precisely in a way that she's asking us not to use,
No,
which is, please let me
yes, yes,
respond.
please go ahead.
Right. So, uh, when we look at emotions suspiciously in a public dialogue, right, that's what you're probably hinting to, that how does one take to an articulation which is labeled as an emotional articulation, right? Uh, so how do I deal with it? Well, I'm I'm primarily a teacher, right? So of course, in regardless regardless of the occasion, so to speak, my primary thrust is always to allow for that flourishing. Okay, so uh, if looking at an emotional articulation and considering it as some kind of anomaly in public discourse, then at the same time, a very detached and at the same time very acutely reasoned statement is also only of a statement of a particular kind and not the statement. You get my point? So, how I deal with it, as I said, is certainly I look for the content of that articulation, and uh, I will not so much, in fact, downplay the emotional part of it. For the longest time, we have trained to look at it that way. That is, cut the clutter, get to the point. That is, what is it that someone is trying to say? And then we may also, in fact, refute anything of value and judgment if it is being said, quote unquote, emotionally, as I said, in the heat of the moment, right? But poetry, literature, any artistic pursuit, even public rhetoric, you know, as an art form, uh, they all tell us that uh, it provides us with great insights into um, all kinds of actions and social relationships which regulate our life. For example, take anger. You know, if we were to banish anger as an acceptable emotion, then we'll probably never witness the most violent and unjust aspects of social life, right? And those that moments where anger is not only justified but necessary, right? Similarly, disgust. She also names it disgust. That how only certain kind of disgust is permissible in. And she's a philosopher who is actually concerned with sustaining a liberal society, right? So let me make that clear. She is writing and thinking in the line of philosophers who write for uh, upholding a certain liberal polity. That's why in the chapter that I shared with you, she is very generously drawn from John Rawls, if any of you are familiar with him, right? Have I answered your question, Irfan? Anyone else? Think?
So, thank you for this enlightened trajectory that you brought to us. So, it's not a question; it's an articulation of my own thought with regard to the session that I'm attending. I think you are completely focusing on Martha Nussbaum, and I just came through the paper that you had sent for our reading. A question or my observation or thought process goes like this: that if emotion has to be removed from any kind of structural system, right? Because end of the day, if emotions can be located somewhere, unlike many other things, emotions can only and only be located in the human beings. There is an embodiment, and we are the one who embody emotions. Is there a disturbance on my end or somewhere else?
I can hear you fine. Yes.
Okay. So I'm just wondering that what is that point of disjuncture or separation where thoughts and emotions finally, see each other off? So, for example, let us just contextualize that I am presenting a paper somewhere, and suddenly, or someone else is presenting a paper, and then suddenly we hear about an accident or something, which is expected to have an emotional outburst in the immediate context, but then because of time constraint, we go on with it, and we do not cancel that whole seminar or that whole lecture or that talk. Um, what would Martha Nussbaum say? Like, what would be her take, and how would she be critiqued? And if that critique is you, is fine.
If I may just ask you to add a little bit on, what would Martha Nussbaum say to what? About what?
To how to negotiate this intersection or disjuncture of thought and emotion. So like I'm in an intellectual pursuit or someone within the seminar space. Yeah. So if you would take the position of critiquing certain aspects of Martha Nussbaum, should we also see it like that you agree with whatever Martha Nussbaum is saying, or you have certain separation of new developed thought as you would understand Nussbaum?
So if I understand you correctly, there are two parts to your question.
Yes.
One is, what do you think my reading says that will be her approach to a situation like that?
Yeah.
Right? Secondly, whether I agree with her.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. To maybe to repeat what I said, she in fact begins her essay anecdotally. She's actually been invited to a university. She was invited to Edinburgh or somewhere, I'm not sure. So she was about to, Trinity College, Dublin. So she was about to give a lecture on emotion. And then she gets a call while she's in a hotel room that her mother has taken seriously ill and she's in a hospital. So she still goes ahead with her lecture next morning somehow. And all the same, of course, quite worried for her mother. And next morning, she takes the first flight back home. And she says that, the second point that I made, that emotion, the object is an intentional object, right? So the way that object appears or figures for someone is how they look at it, see it, interpret it, right? So this is what makes it intentional object. Now, how am I relating to these two? She says that it is this aboutness of the object, which in fact, uh, has a certain degree of entanglement with who I am and how I identify the object. So it is as much about the object. All right. Now, when she's flying back home and she's absolutely, completely, uh, in a state of course, bewilderment. She's not sure whether she can make it, and how whether she's in good health or she's already dead. And then she finds these people going about their lives normally, like these air hostesses smiling and serving during the flight. So she says that, for me, all of that did not make sense in that moment, you know. But then the belief part that these people had nothing to do with what I am going through is what made me, in fact, slot them separately, right? And once she reaches the hospital and she's told that her mother has passed away half an hour ago, she says that all the directedness of my thought towards my mother, it had completely shaped everything that she witnessed during the entire journey, right? So what I'm trying to say with this is that it is not as much of a distinction between what we call thought and emotion, as much as that she's trying to establish that what you call calculative intellectual thought is just at par with the judgment and evaluative judgment which she attributes to emotion. All right? In other words, it does function as thought for her. All right? Now, whether I agree with it or not, I would say to a certain extent, yes. But in some sense, no, because her description of public life is, to my mind, is slightly uncritical. I mean, she's a big professor, she's a moral philosopher. But if you read the chapter that I have sent you, she does not take into account a very resounding critique of the Rawlsian idea of the overlapping consensus, or the idea of a ground zero that liberal politics builds itself upon. So there, of course, her theory does run into trouble because she's straddling two different horses in that sense, where you can't. It's almost like saying that we are inviting everyone to have a shared common understanding of common good and then build a polity around it. But history tells us all the people she names, in fact, Martin Luther, Gandhi, Tagore, she's left out Ambedkar, we can very well add him to the list. They're all products of struggle. They're not products of generosity, right? But reading that conception would actually make you feel that people are generous and a consistent call will invite them to be to arrive at some common ground. However, having said that, she does understand the necessity of emotion, and this is where I agree with her: the necessity of emotion in public life. So what Rawls, in a sense, she says that if you read that introduction carefully, she says, in fact, she finds, I won't say gap, but she finds some ground that Rawls does not choose to engage with in his monumental theory of justice. But she finds that Rawls can already sense its pull in public life, that is of emotion. And she wants to complement that by providing a very thorough and philosophically sound, sustainable account of emotion in public life. So Rawls was for a principle-dependent emotion, as you will find that phrase in that essay. And she goes on to say that what forms should principle-dependent emotions take, and how they can actually go on to create institutions and organizations which can collectively, which can in fact invite people's, general people, as in arm log, common people who make a nation, to find value in it and associate themselves with it, right? Now, I must also reiterate that why did I choose this to share with you, in a program that is focusing on dialogue studies. So in the previous two meetings over the last 2 years, I had sessions on tolerance and on the act of reading, which I thought they allied very closely to any fuller conception of dialogue. I think it's time that we also thought about what generally goes under the name of irrational, unfounded, fleeting, something which is short-lived, something that is not of critical value. That is emotion, which it's a paradox. You look around yourself. It's quite a paradox of our lived life that all our political judgments, in the most banal sense of the term, they are made on the basis of what we call emotions, right? But all our analysis of the same are supposed not to be emotional, right? So we are already functioning with this dichotomy of emotion and thought, which possibly has allowed certain damaging thoughts to circulate emotionally, right? So I'm saying all of this with the assumption that if you would have cursorily looked at that essay, and I apologize that I came quite late to you, that she is already admitting that that how emotions they our societies are woven in emotions, like enmeshed emotions. So probably liberal, that she says a problem with liberalism, which is that it does not allow it a meaningful space, theoretically speaking. And that is why it's time that we turn to emotion as a valuable source of judgment. I hope I have responded to your query to some extent, if not fully.
I'll go back with these thoughts. I think I have to reflect. Yeah.
Yes.
But I have 60% disagreement and 40% agreement, because I also come from half knowledge. I'm reading her also, but in a very, very different context. I'm reading her book with Amartya Sen called Quality of Life, where the arguments are totally different. So I'm just trying to, I was just, anyways, I think I'll leave the space for other people to speak and maybe read some more and get back.
Yes. So just to add to that, the description that I presented to you today is
So I'm looking at the functionality of emotion, because she did not leave the lecture in between and took a flight immediately. She finished her job. That is where there is an entry point of neoliberalism. The labor, the entire workforce, the way our thoughts are constructed around any kind of working functionality doesn't have space for even personal emotions. And even for people who we belong to from day one, if I am in love with someone, I have found that person, and the demise of that person can still be understood. But if it is a husband, and if it is a mother, or if it is a father, or a wife, for that matter, the emotions are understood very differently. If it is a sibling, it is understood differently, and if it is cousins, understood differently. So that is why when I had asked the question, I contextualized it in the context of someone who has met an accident in the institution, keeping that whole relationship a little more distant to understand if Martha Nussbaum will really address that there can be an emotional shift in the person who is actually part of that workforce, presenting something is tied down by the whole institutional context and authority. And so I'm just trying to think it also aloud, but I will read more and get back, because I'm not comfortable completely and do not agree with you completely. Thank you.
Perfect. I have absolutely no grievances there. My only I would add two things to what you have said. One is probably we need to foreground her emphasis on eudaimonia, in order to approach the situation that you're presenting. Does the passing away of an unknown person, does it feature in your eudaimonistic worldview? All right. Of course, quite naturally, parents, sibling, etc. do feature to some extent for any, I don't want to use the word normal, but for an average person, you talk to them. Such is our life. Such it is so structured that there is no way that you will value it. However, if, let us say, a person, forget a person, probably a stray cat, let us say, gets injured in the middle of some intellectual deliberation. Okay?
Danish, I think your voice is just coming a little muffled. I'm not sure if it's just me, and there's some disturbance.
Is there any disturbance? I have not done anything at all that I have not changed anything. My hands are free. So, do you want me to remove this and try?
Yes.
Is it better?
Yes, definitely.
Is it better? All right then. Yes, I'm saying forget a human being, even if a stray cat gets injured in a building where you are presenting a paper, right? If that features, if you actually place the same value, in the sense that you think that it propels you to action, it propels you to sustain your own sense of a flourishing life, then why not? I think this remains a valuable, I would say, reflection on her part. Secondly, I won't go as far to say that her disquisition allows room for neoliberalism to creep in, and she's not making that distinction between personal relations and other kinds of relations. She's making a distinction between emotions, a certain kind of emotion as a set of emotions, and other kinds of emotions, which also comes through in the essay that I have shared with you. And regarding reading further on this topic, she's written this book, Upheavals of Thought, which is the most fulsome explanation of Nussbaum's reflection on emotions. And there's a chapter called Emotions as Evaluative Judgment. So if you want, I can email it to the group. It's a short chapter, but very well written, very conversational, and invites a lot of thought and makes us think further. But why did I choose Nussbaum? Probably because Nussbaum also writes on literature, so that's how I discovered her. Then I discovered other people as well. And I've not read all of them, so of course, goes without saying that I'll only talk about someone I've read. But I would now kind of invite everyone to think a little bit, maybe further on, do you see any value, or how do you think should we place this experience of emotions in the context of public life? What are your views? Because you see, dialogue, as it already, any dialogue presumes two entities, right? And when it is expressed in the terms of self and other, it of course becomes a social act, right? So I in fact wanted to draw some connection, meaningful connection, between how we as participants in public life and public culture. She's using the phrase political culture, but let us also think of public culture, which is slightly more expansive in its scope than the rudimentary understanding of political culture. So we as stakeholders in that public culture, in the public life, how can we examine the place of emotion in the public life that we participate in? Am I making sense with this question? Are you getting the drift as to what am I inviting all of you to think about?
May I say something? Yeah. So, I'm not jumping to your the current urge, like to relate it to the public culture, but I just want to make out two kind of comments, not exactly, but yeah. So related to this, the topics you and Reshmi were talking about. So as there is always a relationship between emotions and rationality, and we always took it as a dichotomy. That is not exactly the correct way of looking at, because we can see emotions if we want to try to understand emotion as per se and rationality as per se. But there is always a relationship as well. So there is, I don't think so, any depart point where we can just exactly say, no, this is the only emotions and this is the only rationality. There's always a connection or always a relationship. And like, it's very obvious that this relationship between emotion and rationality is like preoccupied by human thousands of years back. Like Stoics always said, emotions typically involved with the judgments, and judgments like not even sure, but comes with some kind of rationality as well.
She is in fact with the new Stoics. So yes. Yeah.
So that sometimes harm or benefit, like at the end. So that was I just wanted to make out, and there is always a kind or degree of emotions, like the degree of rationality we judge. There is always a degree of emotions as well. So relating to the public life, if we see any rapist or we heard about it, the degree of emotions always in a negative terms. It always falls in a negative sense. Like the degree of emotions or the kind of emotions we feel for someone who love very much, like my mother, it's always a very different from the someone who's a kind of rapist or a terrorist. So this degree of emotions comes, I think, like I'm not sure I'm making a point or not, but
no, it's an excellent observation. Yes, but don't you think the form, it's the form which we are looking at?
Yeah,
of course, it changes with what is it about, but characteristically speaking, what emotion houses, that remains the same. This is what she's saying. She's trying to present a form, that can we look at it as a useful form, so to speak. Well, I'm mischaracterizing by saying it useful form. What she's saying is that how we can look at it as a form of judgment. Form both in the literal sense as a kind and as well as a form, like formal form. Also, think about the several public policies, which the governments of the day design and implement, right? So these days we have this, lot of hue and cry, very justly so, regarding the climate change, right? Now, think of policies. How do people form and make policies? right? They make policies based on hard evidence-based sciences, right? Social policies, public policies, right? Now, the hard question to ask will be, what is the place of emotion as judgment? How can it figure in something of that kind, right? So even as there is great emotional outburst, let's say, regarding environmental degradation, abuse of natural resources, etc., and this unrelenting capitalist, consumerist tendencies of life across the globe, it only gets expressed as anger, and it only gets expressed as resentment, right? So, but the policies, they do not account for it, do they? I mean, they have their own mold, right? So in public life, can we say that only reasoned, deliberated, that is, with a very virtue of articulation, which I am placing outside of emotion, can that only lead to a meaningful destiny, right? Or can we think of ways in which emotion can also produce that kind of judgment on several aspects of our social relations, and how best can they be expressed collectively, right? So in the essay that I circulated among you, she's talking about patriotism, in an extended manner, using it as an example, right? How love for nation, for this collective which comes together, forms itself as a group, is natural, and it prospers, it flourishes. But at the same time, it does also institute certain feeling of hierarchy, a certain feeling of almost a Manichaean good and bad understanding of regarding certain groups and people, right? It also attributes notions of worth, somebody being of higher worth, and others being dispensable, right? So these days you may have looked at how the crowded airport is gaining all the attention, but I don't think the railway stations ever feature scheme of. And I'm sure there are hundreds of people who are missing their trains or not reaching on time, and all of us have been there. But it doesn't feature, and there are reasons for that. So gradually, even moral outrage has kind of found itself a comfortable home, that only a delay in a particular kind of transportation deserves attention and outrage. So what I'm trying to say is that participation in public life with emotion, with a recognition of emotion as knowledge, emotion as evaluative judgment. This probably is a very fertile way of looking at how we account for others. So, the state has several states, our nation and other nations too. They have anti-discriminatory laws, right? They have anti-discriminatory policies. They have policies that are designed so as to pull people out of that history of discrimination and injustice, right? So that is one formalized aspect of public life. But at the same time, what are the ways in which this recognition of emotion as a source of evaluative judgment can help us participate in that dynamic of social relation, so this is something which prompted me to think of it as important to as of some importance to this collective. And I'll be very happy if you can share your own reflections based on your participation, on your own writings, or whatever you do. Otherwise, I'm sorry to say, but I have not, found out as to what are your institutional affiliations and practices so far. But if any of you would like to reflect on your own practices and talk accordingly, I'll be very glad to hear from you.
I would be sharing the reflections of what participants give after the later. But then also, if somebody wants to share something here, they are more than welcome. Comments or questions either.
Yeah, can I say something?
Please.
Please, James. Yeah. Nice to see you back.
Nice to see you too. Professor, I was just wondering, the way in which Professor Mert van Nussbaum talks about emotion as judgment. For me, I mean, the way I see it, I may be wrong, but the way I see it is, she seems, emotions as judgments seems to me to work only if we have some kind of an immediate, perception of the object, the final object or thing, or some kind of consensus on that. And if the way I see it is to achieve the kind of consensus, or to achieve that kind of a common good, if I can call it that. I mean, it seems to me that we might need a lot of deliberations first. We need to discuss things first, our beliefs, and I mean, how is, I'm trying to, is that, is it even possible? I mean, how can you have a direct and immediate, apprehension of goodness without, first talking things out first, that's the kind of thought that I had while I was listening to your talk. And is that making sense? Is it?
If I may request you to maybe add something more about this talking it out, like what did you mean?
Well, for instance, say in public life, when we are to use emotion as a sort of judgment, my understanding is, and if the emotion is directed towards something, right, it would have to be towards, a conception of something. It would have to be something, and for that, we might have to, discuss. We might have to deliberate, and it's not as if we have a direct and immediate conception of that, without even thinking first. So I'm trying to sort of challenge that a bit, and I'm trying to, trying to talk about how beliefs might be an important ingredient, if I can call it that, towards that conception of emotion as judgment. I mean, belief. It seems to me that belief belief would have to be there. I mean, it's not as if
No, she does.
Yeah.
I mean, sorry about that. Yes. You want to complete or okay?
Oh no, it's
so
yeah.
Maybe if we use the word value more than judgment, probably that will help you think further. Because it is predicated on value. That is, as I said in the last instance, that the directedness of emotion is all about the value of that object within one's own scheme of flourishing of life, right? And you can, of course, contest the idea that these values are not shaped uniformly. I think that can be one of the critiques here, that what you value, that may not be taking shape uniformly. So why you value something, how you value something, what motivates that, that impulse to value something in your own conception of a flourishing life, that may vary from person to person. Okay? Because that is shaped differently for people. Some of them also remain same. For example, all of us, value the idea or the principle of justice, right? So any group of people who claim to have some sort of a filial, national, whatever you want to call it, belonging, they may have some notion of justice and they might be valuing it, right? So the intrinsic value of justice and your own personal value, how you value justice with all your, while it is tied to your idea of eudaimonia, that is very key, then I think it might open up avenues for the kind of call for recognizing emotion as evaluative judgment might, lead us further. So that is my, I must say, limited understanding of what she's getting to. However, even with this bit of description of emotion in our work, I think it does add to something very crucial which is missing in the liberal polity. That is, as I said, it is probably, this concern is probably coming out of a recognition of failure. That is much, I mean, look at the rhetoric of the last 100 years of global politics, whatever has transpired over the vast part of the continents and nations. It is only when emotions have been substituted with emotions that people have been historically able to pull themselves out of it, of something far more destructive. Okay, so instead of emptying emotion of any evaluative value, if we restored it where it properly belongs as something that enables our social action, that I guess will help us course correct ourselves and maybe lead to a more just society. I mean, that's my view, Yeah. It, of course, is fraught. It's fraught with all kinds of risks, goes without saying. But what appealed to me was the idea that emotions do. How do we conventionally, in our normal day-to-day lives, we also surrender in the face of emotions, right? We also give up in the face of emotions. That is, if I'm faced with some kind of fear, if I'm faced with some kind of impending threat, if I'm faced with some kind of guilt, in all these instances, we lend ourselves passively to the workings of emotions. That's the understanding. Now, instead of this, what she's arguing for is that they are not, it's not as if emotion is acting out of elsewhere as some other part of our being. Rather, it is, of course, part of us, and it is not some irrational eruption. It has within us what she calls judgment of value, So let's take the example of a child once again. She, in fact, uses it in one of her examples. That when a child points to something, like wants to reach, grab it, hold it, in that moment, the child is making that move by having already made this judgment that this thing is good for me, right? That this thing is good for me. Now, this very primal instinct of desiring for something, to reach for it, is an emotional act that also houses this ability to judge, houses the evaluative judgment, that it is valuable to me, to my world, to my worth. And this is what she is expanding upon. So, in a dialogic, if I can rephrase it within a dialogic framework, instead of thinking along these 2 points, self and other, if one were to turn inwards towards self and try and expand the scope of the workings of emotion, this probably will, I guess, that to my mind again, chart some ways for us to establish more meaningful channels of conversation as well as exchanges. So that is the limited point I wanted to, in fact, make with this exercise. Please feel free to make comments and share your remarks. Thank you, James, once again.
Thank you.
Please raise your hands for question or comments, or just feel free to unmute and ask. We still have 15 minutes, so we can make use of Danish's time with us.
Okay, so I just want to confirm I'm still processing with the thoughts, and I still have to read a lot from this side. But like, what's it going on? So we're talking about like how we can, or whether we can use emotions while making any public policy or while doing anything related. That are we really like talking about, or are we evaluating how emotions are contributed to making those policies, or whether the policy makers are taking emotion as a evaluative judgment or as a evaluative aspects of making the policies? Like, let's just take an example of environmental policy and environmental policy, whether they are just rationalizing, so we need to lead to the sustainability, or they are also considering the emotional aspects, how humans are very interrelated to nature. That's we also need to consider to look forward for the future. So are we really talking about that, or I'm just moving forward in some other direction? I just want to confirm.
No, I'm not, to be honest, I'm not interested in formulating a policy which is built on the assumption that emotions, have values, or emotions are judgments. My interest is in restoring emotion to public discourse in a legitimate way. All right? Not as an excess to being human, not as something which, comes along with the fact that we're humans, right? So I also want to privilege emotions just as much as other modes of judgments, all right? And this already happens. So the example of public policy that I, shared with you was more to make a point that as an instance of public deliberation, okay? As an instance of deliberation, which is not always public, to be honest. It's just a chosen few who get through to do that. But what I was trying to do with that example was, in fact, to make us think that in what different ways can it make a difference. I don't know what that will look like. I don't know what, but it will certainly not look like how those documents look like now. You get my point? So at the same time, lest I say that it will be better, or will it simply be reduced to some irrational, inchoate mass of thought around the subject? These are not the only two poles available. So if we think in spite of these two poles to our common understanding, probably that's the hard job that is at hand. So emotions are already there in public life. That's the thing. Like we're so conditioned, or we're so used to think of public life in such a way that if there is a deliberation going on, this should not have a place in it, right? Because it is irrational, because it is eruptive, because it is transient, etc. Right? But as she herself demonstrates in the examples in regarding the national anthems, the patriotic songs, the ballads, and the songs about nations like in Walt Whitman or Tagore, right? She's talking about how these are suffused with imageries, which in fact appeal to your emotions, right? And they are also instituting certain kind of judgments in their own history. For example, she says that when Amar Sonar Bangla was written by Tagore, that was an insistent proclamation of a certain national belongingness, which was not masculine and aggressive like what was going on there in the colonial times, right? So a document, sorry, a document which, in a sense, speaks back to some existing opinions, some existing ideas, is also performing the evaluative part, the judgment part, as even as it is appealing to your emotions. You get my point? So this interplay of history and emotions is very, very finally kind of, I would say, teased out in her analysis. And it's very well worth our attention even now. Has it given any food for thought here? Like, is it prompting you to think in that direction?
Sorry? Could you repeat?
Am I not audible?
Yeah, you are. I just missed the last what you asked.
No, I'm saying, has it made you kind of think in that direction? Is it inviting you to kind of re-examine our views on whether it is worth our attention or not?
No, it is. Actually, I just, like we were talking about some different kinds of different aspects. So it was just one aspect I was relating to the public life and emotions. So just one aspect I was relating. So I was asking just you, like, whether I'm thinking in a right direction or is there something?
Yes, of course. And I don't think it only has to be thought in terms of public policies or something.
It's just one aspect I was just thinking.
Yes, exactly. So they're just as useful to think through in terms of reading, in terms of your conversation on a daily basis, in terms of how you view your own filial associations in the extended society, in your own colleges, universities, workplaces. And I think that will be a more fruitful exercise. That and more importantly, as someone, all of you, engaged in understanding what dialogue is, I think I can see a very meaningful connection between this deliberation on emotion as being very crucial to any dialogic activity. That how do you relate to, how do you relate to someone else, right? And this helps us understand that, and maybe also pushes us to enact those judgments, right? So it was with this, assumption that I thought of sharing such reflections with you. Yes.
Thank you. Does anyone have any comments or questions? The ones who not asked. Noor,
Okay.
Imran, Heber, Ayanda, and Kulsum. Or if somebody else who has asked is also more than welcome to ask.
Can I go ahead?
Yes, Irfan, sure.
Yes. So after so much listening to emotions and its different meanings in different situations, can we say that emotions play a very vital role in our lives, and we are emotional in different stages, whether we are at home, we are at an institution, or we are attending, or we have to dialogue someone's. So can you, Dr. Saab, put something that we institutions, whether it is home or our workplace, need some framework to support the emotional supportive conversations, I could say? What are your views that there should be some framework so that never end?
Are you looking for some institutional framework, or are you using framework in a more abstract sense here? I mean, I would say that if you are part of, if you bear witness to any such conversation or any such moment which you think is laced with emotion, then the least we can do is not discount them. Okay? The least we can do is to probably consider them mode of attributing value. And I think that in itself will be quite a task for most of us, So, which is at the same time, I must also caution, which is different from saying, for example, from what I said, one cannot jump on to say that, are you also justifying someone's anger? So whether that articulation is just or unjust is a different matter. But the form of that articulation, that has to be considered just. Am I making my point here? So instead of dismissing something which appears merely emotional, we should probably consider emotional as something which is, a form of judgment. Like thoughts are forms of judgment as well. So are emotions in this case.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening to me, although I think I have poured a good bucket of ice cold water here, but it's all good, happens. And I'll more than love to be in touch and probably correspond with you over emails. If we can think together, wonderful. You can probably share your reflections over there as well. That is reflections on the reading, I mean. And if you want, I can probably email another short chapter which captures most of the arguments that I shared with you. So I can email that to you, You can choose to read it as and when you find time.
Thank you so much, Danish. I have already shared the upheavals of thought in this form, the entire book, in the WhatsApp group that we have. So maybe if you could just let us know the chapter, maybe I can also mention. Sure. And thank you so much for joining us today. We are almost out of time. And I'm sure there has been a lot of discussion in the WhatsApp group while between the participants, and they're sharing. So which is something rare. I'm very happy that there is whatever you have said has invoked a lot of thoughts and a lot of reflection between the students. So thank you so much once again for taking out time. And it was wonderful listening to whatever you said, and it has given, I think, all of us food for thought.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm just as much a learner as anyone else. So, yes, let's hope that we continue to find ways to push it further, and let's imagine a better world, I guess. Thank you. I'll see you all.